Let's discuss dynamic microphones versus condenser microphones. We'll start with the very basics. Dynamic microphones are passive. That means that most of the time they do not require any power to function. They do not require phantom power. There are, of course, a few exceptions here. Condenser microphones, on the other hand, do require power to function, so you need to make sure that your audio interface or preamp is able to provide the necessary voltage or phantom power to function. Condensers also typically have a much higher sensitivity or output a much louder signal than the dynamic counterparts. For example, the U87 I'm using right now, I have 29 decibels of amplification on my preamp. The RE20, which is a dynamic, needs 57 decibels of gain to get to the same level. So when you're working with condenser microphones, you have to worry about your preamp quite a bit less, and if you're miking quiet sound sources at a distance, condensers are going to be much more useful in that scenario. Condensers also commonly sound a bit more natural than dynamic microphones because condensers are able to pick up sounds that cover the entirety of the human hearing range from 20 Hz all the way up to 20 kilohertz, while dynamic microphones, on the other hand, typically roll off some of those higher frequencies, so it sounds a little bit closed off and not as natural and open. Then when we look at dynamic microphones, they have a much simpler construction than condensers, and that makes them a lot more rugged, so if you're really tough on your gear, that can be an added benefit for that microphone type. Dynamics also do an incredible job at handling loud sound sources, so if you're miking up drums, if you're throwing it in front of a guitar cab, dynamics can do really well in that scenario. Then we get to the contentious part of the discussion, which is background noise rejection. It has been said for years, and I have even repeated it, that dynamic microphones do a better job at background noise rejection than condensers. Generally, I still think this holds true, but I don't necessarily think it comes down to the fact they're dynamic microphones or condenser microphones. I think it comes down to the polar pattern and the frequency response. Also, because dynamics typically have a quieter output than condensers, I've noticed that people tend to use those mics closer to their mouth, and that's going to yield a better signal to background noise ratio and further that idea that dynamics reject more background noise than condensers. However, I need to point out there will be dynamics that are great at rejection, others that are not so great. Similarly, there will be condensers that are awesome at rejection and others that are not. That's why I think it's so important to do background noise rejection tests. For example, which one do you think did better rejecting the keyboard, the dynamic or the condenser? Enough waxing poetic about this. I recorded a bunch of tests. Let's hear. Do dynamics do a better job at rejection than condensers? Let's start with the two most similar microphones, which are both handheld. For the dynamic, I'm using the SE Electronics V7. For the condenser, I'm using the Neumann KMS-105. Both of these are super cardioid polar patterns. I am about 4 to 5 inches off of both of them. I will be switching back and forth between them to see which of them sounds like it rejects the most reverb. My AC is also running in the back, so let's see how much of that each of these microphones rejects as well. And what about white noise playing from speakers behind the mics? Next, let's compare a couple of really popular instrument microphones. For the dynamic mic, we're using the classic Shure SM57. For the condenser microphone, we are using the Neumann KMS-184. Both of these are cardioid polar patterns. Again, I'll be switching back and forth between them just to see if we can hear a difference in the amount of reverb that either of the mics picks up. And my AC is still running in the back, so let's see how much of that each of these mics rejects as well. And now for the white noise playing behind the mics. And lastly, we're comparing two of the most popular microphones out there right now. The large diaphragm dynamic is the SM7B in neutral mode. The large diaphragm condenser is the Rode NT1 5th Gen in XLR mode. I'm about 5 inches off of both of these microphones. Both of them are cardioid polar patterns, so they are comparable there. And once again, I will be switching back and forth between them so we can hear if one does a better job at rejecting the reverb. And I will also go ahead and shut up so we can hear how much of the air conditioner each of these mics rejects. And now for the white noise playing from behind the microphones. Next, we're going to be discussing what type of microphone you should get, whether you should get a shotgun, a lav mic, a headset microphone, a studio mic, or a handheld mic, and that's going to be linked directly beneath me as well as in the description.